After the Civil War, the South was devastated. 4 million slaves moved from slavery to freedom, and the United States was, well, anything but united. Reconstruction was a set of policies set forward by the federal government to fix these problems. My name is Brian Reese. Today I'm joined by John Haas and George Jarrett. Today we're talking about Reconstruction. George, why do our students need to understand Reconstruction?
Well, there's two parts, I think. There's the short-term part, that the question of how would you reintegrate the South into the nation. Would it be made to pay and to suffer for what had been done, or sort of let bygones be bygones. But the longer-term question was the question of the role of African Americans. Almost all black Americans lived in the South before and after the Civil War. So the question of would they be equal citizens, what would their role be in American society, was the question that Reconstruction tried to answer and didn't answer, and would be revisited again and again in the future.
Okay, John, before we start to flesh out some of these main points here, why don't you set the stage for us? How do we get to the point where we need a Reconstruction?
Well, I think what you need to do is principally look at the South after the conclusion of the Civil War. The South was absolutely in a shambles. The Democratic Party was, it was moribund. You had 4 million former slaves that were now free, as was just mentioned. And when they were free, the question is, where are they going to go? What kind of jobs are they going to get? Who's going to be out there to help them? We know that the railroads were turned upside down, that the cornfields were burnt. And then, by contrast, if you went up to the north, everything was working. The Industrial Revolution was humming. You could go to the bank. The railroads were on time.
The economy was strong.
The economy was strong, so it's almost like a tale of two different civilizations. How are you going to bring this together? We had 11 former states that now need to be brought in. And I think anytime we deal with Reconstruction, there's a tendency, I believe, to talk about Reconstruction in military terms or in political terms, but not the psychological terms. And I think one Southern writer by the name of Wilbur Cash pointed out, he said that the South was physically destroyed, but that the Southern mind was intact. And what he meant by this was that white supremacy would be up at the top again. The big question for the people in the South, who were the former leaders, is how can we get whites at the top again and blacks at the bottom without the institution of slavery?
All right, so let's talk about African Americans here for a minute. 4 million African Americans moved from slavery to freedom after the Civil War. What are they supposed to do? What's available for them?
And that's the big question that was struggled over during Reconstruction. And the first answer came from the president. During presidential Reconstruction, he essentially said, President Andrew Johnson, who became president because Lincoln was assassinated, essentially said, we'll let the Southerners figure out what to do. We want to change them as little as possible. In fact, he called it restoration and not Reconstruction. Remake things back the way they were. And what happened was he pardoned many Southern leaders, and the same people who were in charge, who had led their states out of the Union and into the Civil War, were now back in charge.
Supporting slavery, et cetera.
They were back in charge. Now, they didn't have slavery anymore. They did accept the 13th Amendment.
Right.
But what they wanted to do was to keep African Americans as a separate caste in society that would do essentially what they'd done before. So
what were the things they tried to do this?
If I could just add something that George has pointed out, Andrew Johnson believed in white supremacy, and he once uttered this prayer, I wish to God that every head of a household had at least one slave to take the menial drudgery off of his life.
Okay.
He had no history whatsoever in the Republican Party. He was not a good person to
So this is the guy leading the charge after the Civil War here, essentially what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
All right, and what were some of the things that they tried to do to keep African Americans, albeit free, in a lower position in society?
Well, I think I can answer two questions. One of the questions was what African Americans did. And I think it's important that there's new extensions of freedom, which might seem small to us, but not to them. The idea of not showing deference anymore, not doffing your cap, not tipping your cap to somebody, not feigning happiness when you're not happy. The idea of maybe going into the city, going into Richmond, Virginia, to walk around. I mean, for them, for these former slaves, these were things that were very big.
That was a way to exercise their newfound rights.
Sure.
Okay.
But the other question that you asked, especially in Texas, there were many African Americans that did not give deference to white people, and many white people got angered by. There were a lot of lynchings and a lot of shootings, particularly in Texas, other places as well, but particularly in Texas, because whites demanded that deference, and when they didn't get it, violence erupted. We also have the emergence of the KKK.
Okay, I was just going to say, it's a period when the KKK starts to get traction.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're missing a brief but important period of the black codes. This is when the Southern elite was still in control of their governments. They passed laws that are meant to keep blacks in their place, in part in reaction to the social question, but I think most essentially the economic question. So they banned things like African Americans selling vegetables within city limits, and probably the most onerous would be the apprenticeship laws and vagrancy laws. They essentially required, in states like Mississippi, that freedmen, which that term applied to all former slaves, men or women, that by the middle of January had to have signed an annual labor contract, and if they hadn't signed it, they would be put in prison. And if you signed one of these contracts, you would be obligated to allow your children to work as unpaid apprentices for your employer, in some cases to the age of 25. Right. And it's really an echo of slavery. In many states, you had to have written permission from your employer to walk the streets or to leave your place of employment. It's
just
really
barely a step past slavery, really.
Right.
Yeah.
It's often called quasi-slavery. There was an African American who was lynched, and his crime was educating other African Americans. I can't think of a greater testimony to education that these whites wanted blacks to be ignorant, not to get an education, not to have their schools to put them down in this very servile condition.
All right, so you've got at least two things we've talked about here. African Americans coming out of slavery and presented with a whole new set of problems. You've got an economy in the South and an infrastructure in the South that's really devastated. What's the government supposed to do about that? What are they trying to do about that, if anything?
Well, there's a real change. What happened is that Republicans in the North, and remember the Republican Party controlled the federal government, saw what was happening in the South, saw what the president, who they never liked to begin with, was doing, and said, no, this is not going to work. We can't restore white supremacy in the South. We can't have something that's almost exactly like slavery. I mean, on the one hand, there was a moral argument. Blacks should be treated as legal equals. They should have legal rights. On the other hand, and this was more appealing to the larger majority of whites in the North, the idea that we're going to have to fight another civil war in 15 or 20 years. We let them have the same kind of power they had before. And so that becomes radical or congressional Reconstruction. Congress takes control. Congress says we need to protect the rights of the freedmen.
Well, I was just going to add, going along with George, 620,000 people died. And a lot of people felt that was a mockery of all those people that died. If the blacks were exactly in the same position that they were essentially before the Civil War, what was the killing all about? Why did 620,000 people have to die if blacks could not claim the rights of the Declaration of Independence, if nothing had changed because of that? And as George mentioned, we have people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner who are radical Republicans, and they are truly radical because they want to take land away from these former Confederates and give it to African Americans. And there was the call back then for 40 acres and a mule. Blacks, more than anything else, wanted economic independence. They wanted their own land before political rights.
How about this idea of restoring the Union? Certainly the United States was not united after the Civil War, and I think one of the goals of Reconstruction was to put it back together. You think it was successful in that sense?
History sometimes look at things narrowly, and then it has the wide lens and the big perspective. I think over the long haul, yes, but you can't kill 620,000 people and then shake hands at the end. So I think that's something that would take a long time for that to happen, and I think today we're still working at it.
What do you think? Were they able to put them back together?
Well, there was a brief period in which the terms to put it back together was equality for blacks in the South, and you get the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and then that period ends because whites in the South refuse to put up with it. You get the rise of the KKK, you get fraud and violence by the Democratic Party, and then by 1876, the presidential election year of 1876 is the turning point, and the Republicans essentially agree to let the white Southerners have home rule. In other words, run the states. They'll go on to pass anti-black Jim Crow laws in exchange for gaining back the presidency in 1877. And so essentially the whites of the country were reunited. They shook hands. They buried the hatchet. But it was at the cost of black equality.
All right, 1 to 2 sentences. How would you summarize this period for our students?
Well, the one point that I would really make to my students is that we are dealing with a legacy of Reconstruction. We might talk about the disputed election of 1876 and say, well, Reconstruction ended there, but we are still dealing with some of the same issues that were around. We still have prejudice. We still have racism. I think we've made great strides, but we have a long way to go. And many people still talk about this second Reconstruction that took place in the 1950s.
Right. George, how would you sum it up?
I would say it was a period of lost opportunity, that there was a chance to make a truly equal, multiracial America in the 1860s and 70s, and it was taken away by terrorists, white terrorists in the South, and it took another century before the United States would even begin to fulfill the promise of the 14th Amendment and legal equality.
Great. Reconstruction tried to achieve three things. First, put the country together again after the Civil War. Second, help African Americans move from slavery to freedom. And third, rebuild the Southern economy. Was the program successful? We'll let you be the judge.